Hell's Angel's son suffered every day until the waitress found something horrifying in his hair. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the open garage door as Tank wiped his grease-stained hands on a red shop rag. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal hung in the air, mixing with the warmth of the fading day. His weathered face softened when he spotted Jesse's small figure approaching, backpack hanging low on his thin shoulders. Something was off. Tank felt it in his gut, the same way he used to sense trouble coming in his old life. Jesse's head was down, his feet dragging against the concrete more than usual. The boy's overgrown hair fell forward, hiding his face completely. "Hey, kiddo," Tank said, keeping his voice gentle despite his imposing frame. "How was school?" Jesse didn't answer. He just shrugged and clutched his backpack tighter, knuckles white against the worn straps. Tank's heart clenched. He'd been that quiet boy once, hiding his own pain behind silence. "Got the Thompson's Chevy running again," Tank offered, trying to draw his son out. "Want to see how I fixed the timing belt?" Another shrug. Jesse shuffled toward his usual spot, a small desk Tank had set up in the corner of the garage where the boy could do his homework or draw. Today, though, Jesse didn't pull out his sketchbook. He just sat there, still as a statue. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now, back to the story. Tank wiped his hands one final time and hung up his shop rag. "Thinking we could grab dinner at Ruby's tonight. What do you say?" For the first time, Jesse looked up slightly, not enough to show his face, but enough to nod. Tank's chest tightened. His boy loved Ruby's. Normally, the mention of their favorite diner would at least get a small smile. 20 minutes later, they walked the 3 blocks to Ruby's diner. The neon sign buzzed warmly against the darkening sky, and the bell chimed as they entered. The familiar smell of coffee and pie filled the air. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customers?" Maggie's voice carried across the diner, warm and genuine. She grabbed 2 menus and met them at their usual booth. Her smile faltered slightly as she noticed Jesse's unusually withdrawn posture. Tank slid into one side of the booth while Jesse took the other, still not looking up. The vinyl seats creaked under their weight. "The usual for you boys?" Maggie asked, her eyes catching Tank's with a silent question. "Yeah, thanks, Maggie," Tank replied, his gruff voice softening around her name. "Double cheeseburger for me, grilled cheese for the artist here." Maggie nodded, her concerned gaze lingering on Jesse. "Coming right up, sweetie." When she returned with their plates, she set Tank's down first. As she placed Jesse's grilled cheese in front of him, the boy flinched visibly, a small whimper escaping his lips. Tank's hands clenched under the table, and Maggie froze, mid-motion, her motherly instincts firing warning signals. From behind the counter, Maggie Pierce couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her heart. She'd seen Jesse quiet before. That was his nature. But this was different. The boy hadn't touched his grilled cheese, and he kept his head bowed so low his chin nearly touched his chest. His small hands remained hidden beneath the table, and every few minutes a slight tremor would run through his shoulders. Tank noticed, too. The big man's eyes kept darting to his son, confusion and concern etched in the lines around his eyes. He'd already asked Jesse twice if he was feeling sick, but the boy just shook his head without looking up. Maggie grabbed a clean glass from beneath the counter and started preparing a chocolate milkshake, Jesse's favorite. She'd seen him light up at the sight of those before, even on his quietest days. The whir of the blender filled the diner as she mixed the ice cream, milk, and chocolate syrup. "Special delivery for my favorite artist," Maggie announced, approaching their booth with the tall glass topped with whipped cream and a cherry. She set it down carefully in front of Jessie. "On the house, sweetheart." For a moment, Jessie remained completely still. Then, slowly, he lifted his head just enough to peek at the milkshake through his messy hair. Tank watched, hope flickering across his weathered face. "Thank you," Jessie whispered, so softly Maggie almost missed it. "You're welcome, honey." Maggie smiled warmly. "You know, I've been saving a fresh piece of paper behind the counter. Been waiting for you to come in and draw something special on it." Jessie's fingers inched toward the milkshake straw, but he still wouldn't look up properly. The movement caused his oversized jacket to shift, revealing what looked like a dark stain on his collar. Maggie's maternal instincts flared. "Jessie, sweetie." She kept her voice gentle, not wanting to startle him. "Would you like to come help me organize the sugar packets? I could use an artistic eye to make them look pretty." Tank nodded encouragingly when Jessie glanced his way. The boy slid out of the booth, his movements careful and measured, as if every shift caused him discomfort. Maggie led him behind the counter, away from the curious eyes of the other customers. She pulled out a chair for him near the coffee station, where she kept the containers of sugar packets and sweeteners. "You know what would make this even more fun?" she said, trying to keep her tone light despite her growing concern. "We could make it a game. I bet you could arrange these packets to make a rainbow pattern." Jessie sat down gingerly, still hunched over. Maggie's heart ached seeing him so withdrawn. Without thinking, she reached out to ruffle his hair affectionately, something she'd done dozens of times before. The moment her fingers touched his head, she felt something wrong, something hard and sharp beneath the tangled strands. Her hand came away, sticky, and when she looked down, her fingers were stained with dried blood. Jessie let out a small, pained gasp and jerked away from her touch, his eyes wide with fear. Maggie's hands trembled as she forced herself to stay calm. Years of teaching had taught her how to keep her voice steady, even when her heart was racing. "Hey, Jessie, would you like to help me with something in the back room? I've got some new art supplies I've been saving for you." Jessie hesitated, his small frame tensing. Tank started to rise from his booth, but Maggie caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. Something told her not to draw attention to whatever was wrong. Not yet. "It'll just take a minute, sweetheart," she said softly. "And maybe, if you'd like, I could give your hair a little trim. Make it easier to see those beautiful eyes of yours." She kept her tone light and playful, though her stomach churned with dread. Jessie glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly, then followed Maggie through the swinging door that led to the diner's back area. The storage room was warm and clean, filled with the scent of fresh bread from the morning's delivery. Maggie had set up a small art corner here months ago, where Jessie would sometimes draw while she worked. Today, she pulled up a sturdy wooden chair near the sink. "Here we go," she said, patting the chair. "Let's make this fun, okay? I used to cut my son's hair all the time." Her voice caught slightly at the memory, but she pressed on. "Did you know I once gave him a mohawk? He loved it." A ghost of a smile flickered across Jessie's face as he carefully sat down. Maggie grabbed a clean towel and draped it around his shoulders. She retrieved her scissors from the drawer where she kept them for opening packages and sterilized them thoroughly with alcohol. "Now, you just sit still, and I'll be super gentle," she promised, her heart pounding as she approached his head. "If anything hurts or you want me to stop, you just say the word." Jessie sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the edges of the chair. Maggie began carefully parting his hair, trying to see what she'd felt earlier. The strands were matted and tangled, stuck together in places with what she now knew was dried blood. "You're doing great, honey," she murmured, working slowly and methodically. Such a brave boy. As she separated another section of hair, she saw it, something metallic glinting in the fluorescent light. Her breath caught in her throat. Embedded in Jesse's scalp, partially hidden by his dark hair, was a small nail. And it wasn't alone. With trembling fingers, Maggie continued cutting through the matted sections, revealing more and more of the horrifying truth. Dozens of tiny, sharp nails had been cruelly glued to Jesse's scalp, some of them pressing painfully into his skin. Dark scabs had formed around several of them where they'd broken the surface. A wave of nausea hit her as she uncovered the full extent of the abuse. These nails formed a pattern. This wasn't random. Someone had deliberately placed them to cause maximum pain whenever Jesse moved his head or tried to lie down. She couldn't hold back her gasp of horror, though she quickly tried to mask it as a cough. Jesse's shoulders began to shake, and when a tear splashed onto the towel around his neck, Maggie had to grip the scissors tightly to keep her hands from shaking. Maggie's fingers shook as she dialed Tank's number on the diner's phone. She had to try 3 times before getting the numbers right. Her other hand rested protectively on Jesse's shoulder as he sat quietly, the towel still draped around him. "Tank, you need to come back. Right now." Her voice cracked. "It's Jesse." The line went dead without a response. Maggie pulled up a chair next to Jesse, speaking softly to him about nothing in particular. The weather, a funny story about a customer who'd ordered 15 pieces of pie yesterday, anything to keep him calm. But her eyes kept darting to the door, counting the seconds. The evening sun cast long shadows through Ruby's front windows when Tank's motorcycle roared into the parking lot. The sound was like angry thunder, making the glass rattle in its frames. Several customers looked up from their meals, forks pausing halfway to their mouths. Tank burst through the door with such force that the bell above it nearly flew off. His massive frame filled the entrance, leather vest creaking as his chest heaved. Wild eyes scanned the diner until they locked onto Maggie. "Where is he?" Tank's voice was low and dangerous. A mother quickly gathered her children and hurried past him to the exit. Maggie stepped forward, hands raised placatingly. "Tank, I need you to take a deep breath. Jesse's okay right now, but where is my son?" Each word came out like a growl. "In the back room. But Tank, please." She reached for his arm as he strode past, but he shrugged her off. Tank pushed through the swinging door so hard it slammed against the wall. "Jesse?" Jesse sat exactly where Maggie had left him, small and still under the towel. At his father's entrance, he seemed to shrink even further into himself. "Take it off," Tank demanded, gesturing at the towel. When Jesse didn't move, Tank's voice softened slightly. "Please, son. Let me see." With trembling fingers, Jesse pulled the towel away. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the back room, every cruel detail was stark and clear. The dozens of nails glinting dully, the dried blood, the angry red marks where metal met flesh. Tank stood frozen, his massive frame suddenly seeming to deflate. His face, usually set in hard lines, crumpled like paper. He took one stumbling step forward, then another, before his knees gave out entirely. The sound that came from Tank's throat wasn't quite human, somewhere between a roar and a sob. He fell heavily to his knees in front of Jesse's chair, his large hands hovering helplessly over his son's mutilated scalp. "My boy," Tank choked out. "My baby boy?" Tears carved tracks through his weathered face, disappearing into his beard. His shoulders began to shake with deep, racking sobs. Jesse reached out one small hand and placed it on his father's shoulder, as if he were the one trying to offer comfort. Tank caught that tiny hand in his own and pressed it to his cheek, his tears flowing freely now. "I'm sorry," Tank wept, his voice broken and raw. "I'm so sorry, Jesse. I didn't know. I didn't see." His words dissolved into anguished sobs that echoed off the storage room walls. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across Tank's face as he paced the waiting area. Back and forth, 7 steps one way, turn, 7 steps back. His heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor with each stride. Maggie sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched Tank's relentless movement, noting how his fists clenched and unclenched with each turn. "Tank," she said softly, "please sit down. You're making everyone nervous." He glanced around the waiting room, suddenly aware of the other patients shrinking away from his path. An elderly woman clutched her purse closer. A young mother pulled her child onto her lap. Tank dropped heavily into the chair next to Maggie, the plastic creaking under his weight. His knee bounced rapidly, a stark contrast to his usual stillness. "How long's it been?" he asked, his voice rough. 20 minutes, Maggie replied, checking her watch for the 100th time. Tank ran his hands over his face, his fingers catching in his beard. "Should have seen it," he muttered. "What kind of father doesn't notice his kids being tortured?" "Hey," Maggie touched his arm gently. "Jesse's good at hiding things. He was scared." "That's worse." Tank's voice boomed through the waiting room, making several people jump. He immediately lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. "That's worse. My own son was too scared to tell me." Before Maggie could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Dawson?" Tank shot to his feet, nearly knocking over the chair. "How is he?" "We're still working on removing the nails. It's a delicate process." The nurse, whose name tag read Carla, spoke with careful professionalism, but her eyes held a mix of sadness and anger. "We're giving him local anesthetic to manage the pain. He's being very brave." Tank's massive frame seemed to collapse in on itself. "Can I see him?" "Soon," Nurse Carla promised. "The doctor wants to make sure we've removed everything first. We're also documenting everything for—" She hesitated. "For the authorities." Tank's jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. As the nurse turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Maggie. With quick, subtle movements, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "This fell out of his shoe when we were getting him changed," she said quietly, pressing it into Maggie's hand. Her eyes held, Maggie's for a meaningful moment before she disappeared back through the doors. Maggie unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was small and neat, but the letters shook slightly, as if written in fear. Her breath caught as she read the words. "They said I'm worthless. But I remember my mom said love wins. Maybe she was wrong." The paper trembled in Maggie's hands. She felt the blood drain from her face as memories crashed over her. Another note, another child's desperate words, another failure to see the pain in time. Tank leaned over, trying to read the note. "What's it say?" But Maggie couldn't speak. She just handed him the paper, her fingers numb. The night air hung heavy with cricket songs and unspoken words. Tank's front porch light buzzed softly, drawing moths that danced in lazy circles around the yellow glow. 2 wooden chairs creaked beneath Tank and Maggie's weight as they sat in shared silence, listening to the occasional car passing on the distant highway. Tank held a cold beer he hadn't touched. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the porch, as if searching for invisible enemies. The hospital had discharged Jesse an hour ago, his head wrapped in white gauze that made him look smaller, more fragile than ever. "He's finally sleeping," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd helped settle Jesse into bed, humming soft lullabies until his breathing steadied into peaceful rhythms. Tank nodded, his throat working. "Thank you. For staying." "Of course." Maggie wrapped her arms around herself, though the night wasn't cold. I couldn't leave him alone. Not after finding that note." The mention of the note made Tank's fingers tighten around his beer bottle. How does a kid that young even think about— He couldn't finish the sentence. Maggie's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I know what those thoughts can do to a child," she said. "What they can lead to." Tank turned to look at her. Really look at her, for the first time since they'd sat down. The porch light caught the tears gathering in her eyes. 5 years ago, she continued, her voice wavering, I had a son. Michael. He was 12. She paused, steadying herself. He was like Jesse, gentle, creative, different from the other boys. Tank set his beer down, the bottle making a hollow sound against the wooden planks. I was teaching 4th grade then. Thought I knew everything about kids, about spotting trouble. A bitter laugh escaped her. But I missed it. My own son, and I missed all the signs. She pulled a tissue from her pocket, dabbing at her eyes. They didn't use nails with Michael. Their weapons were words, isolation, social media. They made him believe he was nothing. Her voice cracked. One morning, I went to wake him for school and— She didn't need to finish. Tank's sharp intake of breath said he understood. The worst part? Maggie's words came out in a pained whisper. We found his journal afterward. He'd been planning it for months, writing about it, begging for help in those pages, but never out loud, because they convinced him that speaking up would only make things worse. Tank's massive hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. A single tear tracked down his cheek, disappearing into his beard. That's why I quit teaching. Couldn't face a classroom anymore. Maggie wiped her eyes again. Started waiting tables at Ruby's instead. Thought I could just hide from it all. But then Jesse started coming in with you, and I saw that same look in his eyes, that same silent scream for help. The crickets seemed louder now, filling the space between Maggie's words. In the distance, a train whistle moaned, a lonely sound that echoed the ache in their hearts. When I found those nails today, she said, it was like God giving me a second chance, a chance to save the child in front of me, since I couldn't save my own. Tank sat motionless, tears now flowing freely down his face, his breathing ragged with emotion. He didn't speak, couldn't speak, but his presence beside her held all the understanding and shared pain that words couldn't express. Morning sunlight streamed through Tank's kitchen window, catching dust motes that danced in the golden beams. The smell of coffee filled the small space, but neither Tank nor Maggie touched their mugs. Jesse was still asleep upstairs, exhausted from yesterday's ordeal. Tank's massive frame seemed too big for the tiny kitchen chair. His fingers drummed against the table, each tap growing more intense. I know where they live, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The Matthews kid. His father works at the lumberyard. Maggie reached across the table, placing her hand over his restless fingers. Tank, stop. Stop? His eyes flashed. You saw what they did to my boy. Someone's got to— Got to what? Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. Show up at their door? Threaten them? Hurt them? She squeezed his hand. Then what happens to Jesse? Tank pulled his hand away, standing so abruptly his chair scraped against the linoleum. Can't just do nothing? We're not doing nothing. Maggie stood too, positioning herself between Tank and the door. We're going to handle this the right way. First step is meeting with the school principal. Tank's laugh was bitter. School? They don't care. Never have. Maybe not before, Maggie said. But now we have evidence. Medical records. Police reports. She stepped closer to him, having to crane her neck to meet his eyes. If you go after those kids or their parents, you'll end up in jail. Then who protects Jesse? The fight seemed to drain from Tank's shoulders. He slumped back into his chair, running both hands through his graying hair. I can't let them hurt him again. And we won't, Maggie assured him. But we have to do this right. 2 hours later, they sat in Principal Weber's office. The man behind the desk looked more annoyed than concerned, shuffling through the medical reports with barely concealed impatience. While this is certainly unfortunate, Weber said, setting the papers aside, we have to consider that boys this age often engage in rough play. Rough play? Tank's voice was deadly quiet. They glued nails to my son's head. Weber adjusted his tie. Mr. Dawson, children can sometimes take things too far, but— Too far? Maggie interrupted, her normally gentle tone sharp with disbelief. This was calculated torture. Mrs. Pierce, Weber sighed, I understand you feel strongly about this, given your history. But boys will be boys. We can't punish every schoolyard scuffle. Tank's massive hands curled into fists. The leather of his jacket creaked as his muscles tensed. Then I'll teach my own kind of lesson. The morning after the disastrous school meeting, Maggie sat at Ruby's diner during her break, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. When Tank and Jesse came in for breakfast, she was ready. I have an idea, she said, sliding into their booth. Jesse kept his eyes on his untouched pancakes, his baseball cap pulled low over his freshly bandaged head. Tank looked up from his coffee, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting another sleepless night. What kind of idea? Tank asked, his voice rough. Maggie spread her notes on the table. I used to be a teacher, remember? I'm certified for elementary education. She pushed the papers toward Tank. We could homeschool Jesse, at least until things get sorted out. Tank's eyebrows drew together as he studied the papers. Homeschool? I could teach him here at the diner during slow hours. Maggie glanced at Jesse, who had lifted his head slightly. The owner won't mind. Ruby's got a soft spot for kids. Tank ran a hand over his beard. What about your job? I'll still waitress during busy times. We can work around it. Maggie leaned forward. Jesse wouldn't have to face those bullies. He could learn at his own pace, in a safe place. For the first time in days, Jesse looked up. His eyes darted between Maggie and his father. Tank studied his son's face. That what you want, buddy? Study with Miss Maggie for a while? Jesse gave a tiny nod, then whispered so softly they barely heard him. Please? Tank's shoulders relaxed slightly. How much? He asked Maggie. We'll figure something out, she said firmly. Maybe you could help Ruby fix that broken dishwasher she's been complaining about. A ghost of a smile crossed Tank's face. Guess I could do that. Later that afternoon, Maggie arrived at Tank's house with 2 canvas bags full of supplies. Jessie sat at the kitchen table while she unpacked them. Textbooks, notebooks, pencils, and finally, a worn wooden art box. This was my son's, she said softly, running her fingers over the scratched surface. He loved to draw. She opened the box, revealing colored pencils, pastels, and several paintbrushes. Jesse stared at the supplies, his fingers twitching slightly. You like to draw, don't you? Maggie asked gently. I've seen your doodles on napkins at the diner. Tank, who had been leaning against the counter watching, straightened up. He gets that from his mama. She was always sketching something. Jesse's eyes widened at the mention of his mother. Tank rarely spoke of her. Maggie pulled out a fresh sketch pad and set it on the table. Art can be part of your lessons too. Sometimes it's easier to say things with pictures than with words. Jesse reached out slowly, his fingers hovering over a paintbrush. He glanced at his father, as if seeking permission. Tank nodded. Go on, buddy. It's okay. With trembling fingers, Jesse picked up the brush. He held it like something precious, something that might break. His shoulders relaxed just a fraction, and for the first time since the incident, his face held a hint of peace. The afternoon sun streamed through Ruby's diner's windows, casting warm patches of light across the empty booth where Jesse sat with his art supplies. The lunch rush had ended, leaving only the gentle hum of the ceiling fans and the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen. Maggie watched as Jesse settled into what had become his usual spot over the past week. He'd grown more comfortable here, away from the harsh fluorescent lights and echoing hallways of school. Here, surrounded by the smell of coffee and pie, his shoulders didn't hunch quite as much. "What would you like to paint today?" Maggie asked, setting down a glass of chocolate milk beside him. She'd noticed he seemed to focus better with something sweet nearby. Jesse shrugged, but his eyes held a spark of interest as he opened the wooden art box. His fingers traced over the paintbrushes before selecting one, handling it with careful reverence. "Remember what we talked about?" Maggie pulled up a chair. "Paint what matters to you, what you see in the world that others might miss." Jesse nodded, dipping his brush in water. His strokes started hesitantly at first, but grew more confident as the image began to take shape. Maggie busied herself wiping down nearby tables, giving him space to create while keeping him in sight. As the afternoon wore on, the painting emerged. A street corner, gray buildings rising in the background. In the foreground, a man in tattered clothes held out a sandwich to a small child. The man's face was weathered but kind, his smile gentle despite his rough appearance. "That's beautiful, Jesse," Maggie said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Is this something you saw?" Jesse nodded, adding careful details to the man's beard. "By the grocery store," he whispered. Everyone walked past him, but... He trailed off, his brush hesitating over the paper. "But what?" Maggie prompted gently. "He shared his food." Jesse's voice grew even quieter. "He didn't have much, but he shared anyway." "That must have meant a lot to you, seeing that kind of kindness." Jesse's hand trembled slightly as he added shadows to the painting. "I drew it at school," he said, his voice barely audible. "During art class." Maggie sat down across from him, sensing there was more to the story. She waited patiently as Jesse stared at his painting, gathering courage. "They saw it," he continued, his fingers tightening around the paintbrush. "The boys who..." His free hand drifted unconsciously to his healing scalp. "What did they say?" Maggie asked, keeping her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "They said..." Jesse swallowed hard. "They said only babies care about stuff like that. That kindness is weak." A tear splashed onto the painting, creating a small dark spot on the corner. "They said real men don't waste time helping people who can't help themselves." Maggie reached across the table, gently covering Jesse's trembling hand with her own. "Jesse, look at me." Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet hers. "Kindness isn't weak," she said firmly. "It takes more strength to be kind in a cruel world than it does to be cruel in a kind one. What you saw, what you captured in this painting, that's not weakness. That's your greatest strength." The mid-morning light filled Maggie's kitchen as Jesse sat at her well-worn oak table, colored pencils scattered around him like fallen autumn leaves. A week had passed since they'd started their daily art sessions, and something had slowly begun to change in the boy's demeanor. And then, Jesse said, pointing to the next panel of his comic strip. The superhero doesn't punch the bad guy. His voice, though still soft, carried a hint of excitement that made Maggie's heart soar. Instead, he shares his lunch with him. Maggie leaned closer, admiring the carefully drawn figures. That's an unusual way for a superhero to handle things, she said, smiling at the detailed expressions Jesse had given his characters. Well, Jesse ducked his head, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Maybe the bad guy was just hungry and scared. He picked up a blue pencil, adding shading to the sky in the background. Like that man at the grocery store. A quiet laugh escaped him as he drew a tiny bird in the corner of the panel. The sound, so unexpected and precious, made Maggie pause in her dish drying. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh since that terrible day at the diner. You know what? Jesse added, reaching for a yellow pencil. I think sometimes people forget that bad guys might just need someone to be nice to them. He colored a warm sun above his characters, his hand steady and sure. Maggie set down her dish towel and pulled up a chair beside him. That's pretty wise for a superhero comic, she said, watching as he carefully lettered the dialogue bubbles. My dad says wise things sometimes too, Jesse confided, surprising her. He told me last night that hurt people hurt people. He paused, considering his words. But maybe help people too? I think that's very true, Maggie said softly, fighting back tears at this glimpse into Tank's private conversations with his son. Outside, the rumble of a familiar motorcycle engine approached. Tank pulled up in front of Maggie's small house, parking his bike under the old maple tree. He'd gotten into the habit of checking on Jesse during his lunch break from the garage, though he usually just watched from outside, not wanting to interrupt their sessions. Through the kitchen window, Tank could see Jesse animated and talking, his hands moving as he explained something to Maggie. The sight stopped him in his tracks. His boy, his quiet, withdrawn Jesse, was gesturing enthusiastically about whatever he'd created, a smile lighting up his face. Tank stood there, his rough hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, watching as Maggie listened intently to Jesse's every word. She nodded encouragingly, pointing at something on the paper that made Jesse beam with pride. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the healing patches on Jesse's head, but for once, Tank didn't focus on the scars. Instead, he saw only his son's smile, heard only the muffled sound of his laughter through the glass. Something tight in his chest began to loosen. In all his years of trying to protect Jesse with fists and fury, he'd never managed to bring out this side of his boy. But here, in Maggie's sunny kitchen, surrounded by art supplies and acceptance, Jesse was slowly emerging from his shell like a butterfly from its chrysalis. Tank blinked rapidly, his vision blurring as he watched Maggie ruffle Jesse's hair, gently, so gently, and his son didn't flinch away. Instead, Jesse leaned into the touch, trust evident in every line of his small body. The wooden pew creaked softly as Tank lowered his massive frame into the last row of Maggie's church. Early morning sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across his weathered hands. He'd traded his usual leather jacket for a clean flannel shirt, though his tattoos still peeked out at the wrists. The congregation's singing filled the small sanctuary, but Tank kept his eyes fixed on the hymnal in front of him, not daring to look up. He could feel curious glances from other churchgoers, their whispers barely audible over the piano. The former Hell's Angel was hardly a typical sight in their midst. A young mother 2 rows ahead clutched her purse closer when she noticed him. Tank pretended not to see, his jaw tightening. He'd expected this reaction. It was part of why he'd chosen the back row, trying to make himself invisible despite his size. As the pastor began speaking about forgiveness, Tank's thoughts drifted to Jesse. His boy was at home, peacefully drawing in his new sketchbook. The angry red marks on his scalp were finally beginning to heal, but Tank knew the deeper wounds would take longer, just like his own. The sermon continued, words about letting go of hatred washing over him. Tank's hands clenched into fists on his thighs as memories surfaced. His father's belt, the sharp sting of buckle against skin, the endless cycle of pain passed down through generations. He'd sworn to be different for Jesse, but here he was, sitting in church because he didn't know how else to stop the rage burning inside him. Maggie's familiar form sat several rows ahead, her honey blonde hair catching the morning light. She hadn't noticed him yet, but her presence somehow made him feel less out of place. She was the reason he'd come, after all. He'd seen how peace seemed to radiate from her despite her own losses, had witnessed how she helped Jesse find his voice again through gentle words instead of force. When the service ended, Tank slipped out quickly, avoiding the usual handshaking and small talk. The cool morning air hit his face as he stood in the church's small courtyard, fishing a cigarette from his pocket with slightly trembling fingers. The familiar ritual of lighting up calmed his nerves. Smoke curled upward in the quiet morning air as Tank leaned against the rough brick wall, processing everything he'd heard. The door opened behind him, and he knew without turning who it was. He'd recognize those soft footsteps anywhere. Maggie didn't speak at first, just stood beside him in companionable silence. Her Sunday dress rustled gently in the breeze, a splash of floral print against the church's weathered walls. After a moment, she turned toward him with understanding in her eyes. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said softly. The late morning sun beat down on Tank's shoulders as he wiped grease from his hands outside his garage. A rusty pickup truck rattled to a stop nearby, its engine making sounds that made Tank wince. Behind the wheel, an elderly man in a faded veteran's cap gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. "Excuse me," the old-timer called out, his voice wavering. "My truck's been making an awful racket. Don't suppose you could take a look?" Tank nodded silently and approached the vehicle. The veteran climbed out slowly, his movements stiff and deliberate. A Marine Corps pin glinted on his cap, and Tank noticed how the man's right leg dragged slightly, an old war wound maybe. "Name's George," the veteran said, extending a weathered hand. "Been driving this old girl for 20 years, but she's never sounded quite this bad." Tank shook his hand, noting the firm grip despite the man's age. "Frank," he replied simply, though nobody had called him that in years. He popped the hood and leaned in, listening to the engine's uneven idle. The problem was obvious, a broken timing belt that could have seized the engine if the veteran had driven much further. Tank grabbed his tools and got to work, aware of George watching him with worried eyes. "How much you figure this'll set me back?" George asked, his voice tight. "Living on a fixed income these days." Tank thought about Jesse at home, probably working on another drawing with Maggie, about second chances and small kindnesses. His hands stilled on the wrench. "No charge," Tank said gruffly, surprising himself. He'd never given away work before. George straightened up, pride flashing across his lined face. "Now, son, I may be old, but I pay my debts." Tank shook his head, focusing on the repair. "Marine Corps, right?" At George's nod, he continued, "My old man served. Never talked about it, but—" He trailed off, remembering the few quiet moments when his father wasn't angry, just sad and far away. "Sometimes the wounds we carry ain't visible," George said softly, understanding in his pale blue eyes. Tank worked in silence for the next hour, replacing the timing belt and checking the other components. When he finished, The engine purred smoothly. No more rattles or knocks. George tried one more time to pay, holding out a worn leather wallet. Tank just wiped his hands and shook his head. "Take care of yourself, sir." The old veteran's eyes misted over as he climbed back into his truck. He paused before closing the door. "You're a good man, Frank. Don't let anyone tell you different." Tank watched the pickup drive away, something tight in his chest loosening just a bit. He didn't notice Mrs. Peterson from next door watching from her window, phone pressed to her ear. The following afternoon, a knock at his door pulled Tank from his paperwork. He opened it to find Mrs. Peterson, a plump woman in her 60s, holding a still warm apple pie. "Heard what you did for old George yesterday," she said, thrusting the pie into his startled hands. "About time someone showed that sweet man some kindness. Thought you might enjoy this." Tank stared at the pie, its golden crust decorated with tiny leaves, completely baffled by this unexpected gesture. The scent of cinnamon and apples wafted up, reminding him suddenly of Sunday dinners from his childhood, before everything went wrong. He started, then stopped, not knowing what to say. Mrs. Peterson just smiled and patted his arm before turning to leave, humming as she walked back to her house. Tank stood in his doorway, holding the pie, looking utterly confused by this simple act of neighborly kindness. The church basement hummed with activity as volunteers set up easels and arranged art supplies for the upcoming community art contest. Maggie stood by the bulletin board, studying the colorful flyer announcing this year's theme, Building a Better Community. Jesse sat at a worn wooden table nearby, absently sketching in his notebook. His hair had grown back evenly now, and the physical scars were healing. But Maggie noticed how he still hunched his shoulders whenever someone walked too close. "You know," Maggie said casually, settling into the chair beside him, "I think you should enter the contest." She gestured toward his notebook, where a detailed drawing of two friends sharing lunch took shape. Jesse's pencil stilled. "I don't know," he mumbled, starting to close the notebook. "Wait," Maggie said softly. She gently placed her hand on the page. "Jesse, your art speaks to people. It shows them what kindness looks like." He glanced up at her, uncertainty written across his face. "But what if they laugh? What if they think it's stupid?" "Then they're missing out on something beautiful," Maggie replied. She pulled out her phone and showed him pictures of previous contests. "Look, they give you a whole wall to work with. You could create anything you want." Jesse's eyes widened as he scrolled through the images. "A whole wall?" Maggie nodded, watching hope flutter across his features. "The winner's art stays up for a whole year. Hundreds of people would see it." "Could I—" Jesse hesitated, then continued in a whisper. "Could I make something that might help other kids? Kids like me?" Maggie's heart squeezed. That would be perfect. For the next 2 weeks, Jesse worked tirelessly on his design. Tank cleared space in their garage, watching proudly as his son sketched and erased, planned and revised. Maggie brought reference books from the library and helped him practice with different paint techniques. The day of the contest arrived bright and clear. Jesse's hands trembled as he worked, but his strokes were sure and steady. Hour by hour, his vision took shape on the church wall. Tank and Maggie took turns bringing him water and snacks, neither one trying to peek at the work in progress. As the sun began to set, Jesse finally stepped back from the wall. "It's ready," he said quietly. Word had spread through the small town, and a considerable crowd had gathered for the unveiling. Jesse stood between Tank and Maggie as Reverend Thompson pulled away the sheet covering the mural. Gasps filled the air. The mural showed a school hallway, but transformed into something magical. In one corner, An older student helped a younger one pick up dropped books. In another, a group of children invited a lonely student to join their game. The center showed two students standing between a bully and his intended target, their stance peaceful but firm. Throughout the scene, golden light seemed to radiate from each act of kindness, connecting all the figures in a warm glow. Above it all, in beautiful flowing letters, were the words, "Be brave, be kind." Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The school principal, who had come at Maggie's invitation, cleared his throat repeatedly and looked away. Even some of the teenagers present shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing themselves in the scene. Maggie squeezed Jessie's shoulder, her own tears falling freely. Tank stood straight and tall beside his son, his usual gruff expression softened with pride and love. The crowd fell silent as they absorbed the power of Jessie's message, his art speaking volumes about courage, compassion, and the choice each person faces every day, to hurt or to help, to turn away or to stand up, to be brave and to be kind. Jessie's mural had started something no one expected. It began with a photo shared by Mrs. Peterson on her Facebook page. By morning, the image had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from across the country, praising the young artist's vision and message. "Look at this, Dad," Jessie said softly, showing Tank his teacher's laptop during their morning homeschool session. The screen displayed yet another news article about the mural, this one from a major city newspaper. "They're saying it's inspiring." Tank leaned over, his weathered face softening as he read the comments. People weren't just talking about the art. They were sharing their own stories of bullying, of standing up, of choosing kindness. Some were even asking how they could help. The church's answering machine filled up with messages. Boxes began arriving at the front door. Art supplies for the children's program, canned goods for the food bank, letters of support. The small post office had never been so busy. "It's extraordinary," Reverend Thompson told Maggie as they sorted through another pile of donations. "Our food drive usually struggles to fill 2 boxes. Now look." He gestured to the growing mountain of supplies in the church basement. A local news van pulled up outside Ruby's diner the next morning. The reporter, Sarah Chen, had kind eyes and spoke gently to Jessie as she set up her camera. Tank hovered nearby, arms crossed, protective as always. "Can you tell me what inspired your mural?" Sarah asked, adjusting her microphone. Jessie glanced at Maggie, who gave him an encouraging nod. He paused, gathering courage. "I wanted to show that being kind isn't weak, that standing up for someone takes real strength." The camera captured his quiet words, his earnest face, the healing scars visible in his newly grown hair. Behind him, the mural's colors seemed to glow in the morning light. The story aired that evening. Tank, Jessie, and Maggie watched it together at Ruby's after closing time, sharing a plate of fries. The piece was beautifully done, respectful of Jessie's privacy while highlighting the impact of his art. The next morning, Sheriff Mendoza's patrol car pulled up to Tank's garage. Jessie tensed automatically, but the sheriff's warm smile put him at ease. "I saw your mural, Jessie," she said, crouching down to his eye level. "It got me thinking. Our town square's looking pretty bare these days." She glanced at Tank, then back to Jessie. "How would you feel about creating something new there? Something the whole town could see?" Jessie's eyes widened. The whole town square?" The sheriff nodded. "Right where everyone can see it, where it can remind us every day what kind of community we want to be." In the background, Tank moved closer to where Maggie stood. Their shoulders touched, a quiet point of connection. As Jessie began excitedly discussing ideas with the sheriff, Tank's hand found Maggie's. She squeezed it gently, and they stood together, watching, Jesse's face light up with possibility. The morning sun caught the silver in Tank's beard as he turned to look at Maggie. Without words, they moved into a gentle embrace, their hearts full with the transformation they were witnessing, not just in Jesse, but in their whole community. Through the garage window, the church steeple was visible, its shadow pointing toward the town square where Jesse's next canvas awaited. The bell above Ruby's diner's door chimed as Tank and Jesse walked in, their usual evening ritual now including Maggie joining them for dinner. The red vinyl booths squeaked as they settled in, the familiar scent of coffee and pie filling the air. Jesse had his sketchbook tucked under his arm. These days, it went everywhere with him. "I saved us the corner booth," Maggie said, sliding in next to Jesse. Her eyes sparkled with the day's excitement. "And Cook made your favorite mac and cheese." Tank watched as his son's face lit up. The change in Jesse over the past weeks was like watching a flower slowly unfold in the sun. Gone was the constant hunched posture, the nervous glances. Instead, Jesse spread his sketchbook on the table, colored pencils rolling across the surface. "Look what I drew today," Jesse said, flipping through pages until he found the right one. "It's Dad as a superhero." Maggie leaned in, her laugh warm and genuine. "Oh my goodness, is that Tank on a motorcycle with a cape?" "Yeah." Jesse's giggle bubbled up, surprising and delightful. "See? He's got his wrench instead of a hammer like Thor, and his superpower is fixing things that are broken." Tank's throat tightened as he studied the drawing. There he was, rendered in Jesse's careful strokes, his beard wild and flowing, tattoos transformed into magical symbols, a determined look in his eyes as he rode through the sky on his gleaming bike. "And look," Jesse continued, his voice growing more animated. "His sidekick is Miss Maggie." He flipped to another page where Maggie wore a flowing dress made of sunbeams, spreading light wherever she went. Maggie's eyes misted over, but her smile never wavered. "That's beautiful, Jesse. You've captured us perfectly." Jesse's laughter came easier now, flowing freely as he showed them more drawings. He'd created an entire comic strip where Tank and Maggie fought against the forces of meanness with kindness and courage. Tank couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his son laugh like this, if ever. They shared plates of mac and cheese, passing around Jesse's sketchbook and adding silly details to each other's characters. Tank even found himself chuckling when Jesse drew him with muscles bigger than the Hulk's. "Dad, you need a superhero name," Jesse declared between bites. "How about the Gentle Giant?" "Perfect," Maggie said softly, meeting Tank's eyes across the table. Later that night, after they'd said goodbye to Maggie and driven home, Tank tucked Jesse into bed. The boys' room was different now. Artwork covered the walls, each piece a testament to his growing confidence. The nightlight cast a warm glow over his son's peaceful face. Tank knelt beside the bed, his large frame casting a shadow in the dim light. Jesse's breathing had already grown steady and deep. Carefully, Tank adjusted the blanket around his son's shoulders, remembering how not long ago he'd been afraid to even touch Jesse's head, for fear of hurting him. Looking at his sleeping boy, Tank felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, love, amazement at this gentle soul who somehow saw him as a hero. He leaned closer, his whisper barely disturbing the quiet. "I'm proud of you, son." Jesse sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window as he worked on a new drawing. His phone buzzed, a rare occurrence since he'd left school. Curious, he picked it up and read the message. "Hey Jesse, it's Mike from Ms. Thompson's class. Some of us are playing soccer at the old field behind school. Want to join? We miss having you around." His heart quickened. Mike had always been nice to him, one of the few kids who sometimes smiled at him in the hallways. Jesse glanced at the clock. His dad was still at work, and Maggie wouldn't arrive for their afternoon art session for another hour. He typed back hesitantly, "Really? You want me to play?" The response came quickly. "Of course. We feel bad about everything. Want to start fresh?" Jesse's hand trembled slightly as he held the phone. He'd been feeling stronger lately, braver. Maybe things could be different now. His art had made people see him differently. Maybe his old classmates had changed too. "Okay," he typed. "What time?" "Now's good. We're already here." Jesse looked out the window toward the school building, visible a few blocks away. The old soccer field behind it had been his favorite place once, before everything changed. He scribbled a quick note for Maggie in case she arrived early. "Playing soccer with Mike. Back soon." The walk to school felt both familiar and strange. His feet remembered the route, even though he hadn't taken it in weeks. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under his sneakers. He clutched his phone tightly, Mike's friendly messages giving him courage. As Jesse rounded the corner of the school building toward the field, his steps slowed. The soccer field was empty. No balls, no kids, no Mike. "Hey, freak." The voice came from behind him. Jesse's stomach dropped as he recognized it. Not Mike's voice at all, but Tommy's. The same Tommy who'd held him down that day while the others. Jesse spun around. Tommy wasn't alone. 4 boys emerged from behind the dumpsters, faces twisted in cruel smiles. One of them held Mike's phone. "Borrowed this from Mike's locker?" Tommy sneered. "Pretty stupid of you to believe anyone actually wanted to play with you." Jesse backed away, his heart hammering. But there was nowhere to go. They'd positioned themselves between him and the street. The brick wall of the school pressed cold against his back. "Your little drawings made us look bad," another boy growled. "Made the whole school look bad." "Please," Jesse whispered. "I didn't mean—" The first punch caught him in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs. Jesse crumpled, trying to protect his head as kicks and fists rained down. Pain exploded across his face. Someone grabbed his hair, thankfully now free of nails, and slammed his head against the wall. The last thing Jesse saw before darkness took him was his own mural across the street. The words, "Be brave, be kind," now seeming very far away. He didn't feel the final kicks. Didn't hear the boys run away laughing. Didn't hear Tommy spit, "That's what you get for telling," as they left him crumpled on the cold ground behind the school. The sun was setting when Tank's heavy boots pounded across the parking lot, Maggie's frantic calls of "Jesse" echoing off the brick walls. They found him there, unconscious, his face bruised and bleeding, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. The emergency room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Jesse's bruised face as doctors rushed him through the double doors. Maggie's hands shook as she filled out paperwork, her vision blurring with each checkbox and signature line. The antiseptic smell, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the steady beep of monitors. It was all too familiar. 5 years ago, she'd sat in a chair just like this one, filling out similar forms with trembling fingers. Different hospital, different child, same crushing weight in her chest. Her son Michael's face superimposed itself over Jesse's in her mind. Both boys so gentle, so creative, both targeted by cruelty they couldn't understand. Tank paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his massive frame making the space seem smaller. His knuckles were white where he gripped his leather jacket, jaw clenched so tight Maggie could hear his teeth grinding. She recognized the rage in his eyes. She'd felt it herself, that helpless fury that came with watching your child suffer. "Family of Jesse Dawson?" a nurse called out, her voice steady and professional. They both rushed forward. The nurse didn't question Maggie's presence beside Tank, perhaps sensing her need to be there. "Jesse has a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured arm," the nurse explained. "We're also concerned about internal bleeding, so we're taking him for some scans." Maggie's knees buckled. Tank's arm shot out to steady her, his calloused hand gentle despite his obvious tension. "He's going to be okay," the nurse added quickly, "but he'll need to stay overnight for observation." They were led to Jesse's room. He looked so small in the hospital bed, his face a canvas of purple and blue bruises. An oxygen monitor glowed softly on his finger, and white bandages wrapped his chest and arm. Tank dropped heavily into the chair beside the bed, reaching out to touch Jesse's hand with uncharacteristic tenderness. Maggie stood by the window, watching darkness settle over the parking lot. The last time she'd stood in a hospital room like this, she'd been alone. Michael had already slipped away by then, leaving nothing but a note and a lifetime of what-ifs. A soft whimper from Jesse snapped her back to the present. He was stirring, eyelids fluttering. "Dad?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here, son." Tank's voice cracked. "I'm right here." Jesse's good hand clutched at his father's. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone. They tricked me." "Shh," Tank soothed. "Not your fault. None of this is your fault." Maggie moved closer, her heart breaking as Jesse tried to smile through split lips. "Hey, buddy," she managed. "You're safe now." A doctor entered with a clipboard, asking to speak with Tank privately. Tank squeezed Jesse's hand before following the doctor into the hallway. Maggie sat with Jesse, humming softly as he drifted back to sleep. When she stepped out later to get coffee, Tank was gone. His chair was empty, his jacket missing from the hook by the door. A nurse mentioned seeing a big man with tattoos heading toward the parking lot, his face set like stone. Maggie's blood ran cold. She knew that look, had worn it herself in the darkest days after Michael's death. It was the look of someone who'd reached their breaking point, someone who'd decided that justice and vengeance were the same thing. She rushed to the window, scanning the parking lot, but Tank's motorcycle was already gone. The night swallowed any trace of where he might have headed, leaving only the echo of engines in the distance and the growing fear in Maggie's heart. Tank's motorcycle growled to a stop outside a ramshackle house on the edge of town. Beer cans littered the dying lawn, and a broken screen door banged in the night wind. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, years of stored rage bubbling to the surface. The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across peeling paint and warped wood. Through the window he could see Bob Miller sprawled in a threadbare armchair, surrounded by empty bottles. The man who'd raised the boy who'd hurt his son. Tank's throat tightened as memories flooded back. Memories of another drunk man, another broken home, another cycle of pain passed down like a poisoned inheritance. The sound of breaking glass from inside made Tank flinch. He remembered that sound from his own childhood, the crash that always came before the shouting, before the belt, before the lessons about how real men don't cry. His knuckles cracked as he flexed his fingers. It would be so easy. One punch for every nail they'd glued to Jesse's scalp. One broken bone for every tear his boy had shed. Violence calling to violence, just like it always had. But Jesse's face flashed in his mind. Not the bruised and battered face from the hospital, but the smile he'd worn while painting his mural. Be brave. Be kind. The words his son had chosen haunted him now. Tank's boots felt heavy as lead as he climbed the creaky steps. The door wasn't locked. It never was in houses like this. The smell hit him first. Stale beer, unwashed clothes, and desperation. Bob Miller looked up through bloodshot eyes, struggling to focus. "The hell you want?" Miller slurred, trying to stand but failing. Tank towered over him, every muscle screaming for action. His fists shook at his sides as he looked down at this mirror image of his own father. This echo of everything he'd fought so hard not to become. "Your boy," Tank's voice was rough with emotion. "The one who hurt my son." Miller sneered. "Boys need to learn to be tough. World ain't gentle." Those words, Tank had heard them before, in another house, in another time. They tasted like copper in his mouth, like blood from split lips and broken promises. "That what your old man told you?" Tank asked quietly. "That what you really believe?" Miller's face twisted. "Get out of my house before you what?" Tank stepped closer, but not to threaten. His voice dropped lower, gentler. "Before you teach me a lesson? Like your daddy taught you? Like his daddy taught him?" Something flickered in Miller's bleary eyes. Recognition, maybe, or fear. Not of Tank's fists, but of the truth in his words. "I came here tonight to hurt you," Tank admitted, his voice breaking. "To do what I know how to do, what I was taught to do." He took a deep breath. "But I'm asking you instead, don't break your boy like my old man broke me." Miller stared up at him, mouth working soundlessly. The bottle in his hand slipped, rolling across the stained carpet. "We can stop it," Tank continued, tears burning his eyes for the second time that week. "Right here, right now. Don't let your boy grow up thinking his fists are all he's got. Don't let him learn that pain is the only language men speak." The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of inherited hurt. Two men, shaped by the same brutal legacy, standing at a crossroads. "Please," Tank whispered, "don't do to your boy what my father did to me." The sun crept over the horizon, painting the old church in shades of pink and gold. Maggie's footsteps echoed across the empty parking lot as she approached the familiar figure sitting on the steps. Tank's broad shoulders were slumped, his leather jacket torn at the sleeve. Dried blood crusted the corner of his mouth. Her heart skipped a beat. After his disappearance from the hospital, she'd feared the worst. That rage and vengeance had won. But something in his posture told a different story. This wasn't a man celebrating violence. This was someone wrestling with change. "Tank?" Her voice was soft, careful. He looked up slowly, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Been sitting here a while," he said, his voice hoarse, "trying to make sense of things." Maggie sat beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd him. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and possibility. "You're hurt," she observed, gesturing to his split lip and the tear in his jacket. Tank touched his lip gingerly, then let out a quiet laugh that held no humor. "Saw two kids fighting behind the grocery store on my way here. One had the other pinned down, was really going at him." He paused, looking at his scraped knuckles. "I got between them, took a few hits breaking it up." "You broke up a fight?" Maggie couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Yeah." Tank's eyes focused on something distant. "The kid doing the beating. He was crying while he threw his punches. Reminded me of myself at that age, all that pain coming out sideways." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree beside the church. Maggie waited, sensing there was more. "I talked to Miller last night," Tank continued. "The bully's father. Saw myself in him too. Same demons, same battles." He rubbed his face with both hands. "It's like a poison, getting passed down generation after generation. Someone's got to say enough." Maggie's hand found his shoulder, feeling the tension there. What did you do? What I should have done years ago. Talked. Just talked. Tank's voice cracked slightly. With Miller, with those kids this morning, I chose different, better. He turned to look at her, his eyes vulnerable but determined. I didn't hit anyone. That's not who I am anymore. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft rustle of sheets. Jesse's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the morning light streaming through the window. His head felt heavy, wrapped in fresh white bandages that smelled of antiseptic. Tank sat in a chair beside the bed, his large frame making the hospital furniture look tiny. His eyes were red-rimmed but gentle as he watched his son wake up. Maggie stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee. Dad? Jesse's voice was scratchy. Tank immediately leaned forward, taking his son's small hand in his calloused one. I'm here, buddy. Right here. Tank's voice was softer than Maggie had ever heard it. Jesse blinked a few times, his free hand touching the bandage on his head. His face crumpled slightly as memory returned, but then something else crossed his features. Not fear, but worry. The mural, he whispered. For the town square. I was supposed to start planning it this week. Maggie set her coffee down and moved to the other side of the bed. Oh, sweetie, don't worry about that right now. You need to rest and... But it's important, Jesse interrupted, his voice stronger. The sheriff said... He said it could help other kids. Kids like me. His fingers twisted in the hospital blanket. I don't want to let everyone down. Tank squeezed his son's hand. You couldn't let anyone down if you tried, kiddo. Your father's right, Maggie said, sitting on the edge of the bed. But something happened while you were sleeping. The whole town found out what those boys did to you. Jesse's eyes widened with worry. Are they mad at me? No, honey. Maggie smoothed his hair back from his forehead, careful to avoid the bandage. They're mad at the bullies, and at themselves, for not seeing what was happening sooner. The mayor called a special town meeting last night. Really? Jesse looked between Maggie and his father. Tank nodded. The whole town showed up. They voted for new anti-bullying programs in all the schools, the sheriff starting a youth outreach program. He managed a small smile. And everyone's asking about your mural. They want it more than ever. They do? Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out a handful of cards. These came for you this morning, from your old classmates, teachers, even people you've never met. She spread them out on the blanket, hand-drawn cards filled with messages of support and bright colors. Jesse picked one up with trembling fingers. His eyes grew wet as he read the message inside. They like my art? They love it, Maggie assured him, and they want to help. The hardware store is donating all the paint you'll need. The construction company offered to prep the wall. Even Mrs. Chen from the art supply store wants to give you special brushes. The whole town's got your back now, son, Tank added. No more hiding in shadows. No more being afraid. Jesse was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he looked up at Maggie with those deep, thoughtful eyes of his. So, the mural's still happening? You bet it is. Maggie squeezed his shoulder gently. Whenever you're ready, the whole town will be there to help, every step of the way. She smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You're not alone anymore, Jesse. Not ever again. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the three of them. For the first time since waking, Jesse smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and lit up his whole face. The high school auditorium buzzed with energy as people filled every seat. Extra chairs lined the walls, and still more townspeople stood at the back, shoulder to shoulder. Tank sat in the front row with Jesse, who kept his eyes fixed on his sneakers. Maggie sat on Jesse's other side, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, her usual composed demeanor touched with obvious emotion. "We've failed our children," she began, her voice carrying through the packed room. "What happened to Jesse Dawson should never happen to any child. But tonight, we have a chance to make real change." Parents stood up one after another, sharing stories of their own children's struggles with bullying. Mrs. Chen from the art supply store dabbed at her eyes as she described finding her daughter hiding in the storage room after school, too afraid to walk home. "My Tommy's been coming home with mysterious bruises," another mother admitted, her voice shaking. I thought he was just clumsy. After hearing Jesse's story, I finally asked him the hard questions." The school principal, who had once dismissed Tank's concerns with "boys will be boys," now stood before the crowd, his face etched with shame. "I was wrong," he said simply. "We need a complete overhaul of our policies. No more looking the other way, no more excuses." Dr. Sarah Martinez, the town's child psychologist, presented a comprehensive plan for trauma-informed care in schools. "Children who bully often come from homes where they themselves are victims," she explained. "We need to break the cycle. That means helping both the bullied and the bullies find better ways to cope." The sheriff outlined new reporting procedures and youth intervention programs. "And we're starting art therapy sessions," he added, glancing at Jesse with a gentle smile. "Sometimes kids can paint what they can't say." Jesse lifted his head slightly at that, his eyes brightening with interest for the first time that evening. When the mayor called for a vote on the new anti-bullying measures, hands shot up across the auditorium. The motion passed unanimously. People cheered, some wiping away tears. "This is just the beginning," Mayor Thompson said. She stepped down from the podium and walked directly to Jesse. "Young man, would you come up here for a moment?" Tank gave his son an encouraging nod. Jesse stood slowly, his shoulders hunched slightly, but his steps were steady as he made his way to the front. "Jesse Dawson," the mayor said, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened to you was terrible. But instead of letting it break you, you showed us a better way. Your art spoke when words failed. Your courage in speaking up finally opened our eyes." She turned to address the crowd. "This young man's story was our wake-up call. His talent reminded us that kindness isn't weakness, it's the strongest force we have." The mayor knelt down to Jesse's level, looking him in the eyes. "You are our bravest citizen," she said, pulling him into a gentle hug. "Thank you for showing us the way." The auditorium erupted in applause. Jesse's cheeks flushed red, but he stood a little straighter. Tank watched from his seat, tears streaming unashamedly down his bearded face. Maggie squeezed his hand, her own eyes glistening. As the applause continued, Jesse looked back at his father and Maggie, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since the bullying began, he looked truly safe. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Riverside Elementary's main office as Maggie sat across from Principal Roberts, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. 5 years had passed since she'd last set foot in a classroom. The weight of that time pressed heavily on her shoulders. "We need teachers like you, Mrs. Pierce," Principal Roberts said, sliding the reinstatement papers across his desk. "Someone who understands what these kids are going through." Maggie's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. "I never thought I'd teach again," she admitted softly. "After Michael." Her voice caught on her son's name. "That's exactly why you're perfect for this," Roberts insisted. "You've lived it. You understand the stakes." She signed the papers, her signature flowing across the dotted line. Something inside her chest loosened, like a knot finally coming undone. The next week, Maggie stood in her new classroom, running her fingers along the freshly painted walls. The room smelled of possibility and art supplies. Easels lined one wall, while the other displayed blank canvases waiting to be filled. In the corner, a cozy reading nook held pillows and books about courage, empathy, and healing through art. Tank helped her arrange the last of the furniture, his massive frame looking comically out of place among the child-sized chairs. "Jesse hasn't stopped talking about starting here," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "First time I've seen him excited about school in, well, ever." The Courage and Kindness Initiative launched on a crisp Monday morning. Jesse arrived early, clutching his art supplies to his chest. His hair had grown back evenly now, no traces left of the old wounds. He hesitated in the doorway, taking in the bright space. "Welcome to your new art studio," Maggie said warmly, gesturing to an easel by the window. Jesse's face lit up as he spotted the mural supplies laid out. "Can I really paint on the walls?" "That's exactly what they're for," Maggie assured him. "We're going to fill this place with hope." Throughout the morning, Jesse worked steadily on his first classroom mural. His brush moved with confidence now, creating scenes of children helping each other up, standing together against darkness, sharing lunches and smiles. The colors were vibrant, alive with possibility. Other students began trickling in during their free periods, drawn by curiosity. They watched Jesse work, asking questions about his technique, his inspiration. He answered softly at first, then with growing confidence. "I used to think being different made me weak," he told a small group gathered around his mural. "But now I know it makes me strong." He dipped his brush in yellow paint, adding rays of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Sometimes the hardest thing is just telling someone you're hurting." A quiet boy named Marcus hung back, watching intently. Maggie noticed him rubbing his wrists, where long sleeves covered what might have been bruises. Jesse noticed, too. He set down his brush and walked over. "Want to help me paint?" he asked simply, holding out a clean brush. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. As they worked side by side, Jesse shared his story in gentle pieces, each word carefully chosen. Marcus listened, his brushstrokes becoming steadier with each passing minute. By the time the lunch bell rang, he had added his own small contribution to the mural. A tiny figure stepping out of shadows into light. Maggie watched from her desk, her heart full. This was healing in action, she thought. Not just through art, but through connection, through shared understanding, through the courage to speak and the kindness to listen. Jesse was no longer just her student. He had become a teacher in his own right, showing others the path from darkness to light, one brushstroke at a time. The kitchen chair squeaked against the linoleum floor as Tank positioned it in front of the bathroom mirror. Early morning sunlight filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow on the worn tiles. Jesse sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, watching his father's reflection. Tank ran his fingers through Jesse's uneven hair, grown out messy and wild since that day at the diner. His large hands, usually so sure when working on engines, trembled slightly as he picked up the scissors. "You trust me with this, buddy?" Tank's voice was gruff but gentle. Jesse nodded, meeting his father's eyes in the mirror. "Yes, Dad." Tank draped an old beach towel around Jesse's shoulders, careful not to pull it too tight. The memory of finding those nails in his son's scalp still haunted him, making each touch deliberate and tender. "Used to cut my own hair in prison," Tank said softly, combing through a section of Jesse's hair. "Never thought I'd be doing this for my boy." He paused, scissors hovering. "Tell me if anything hurts, okay?" Okay, Jesse whispered, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The quiet snip of scissors filled the small bathroom. Tank worked slowly, methodically, the way Maggie had shown him. Each lock of hair that fell represented another layer of pain being shed, another step toward healing. Jesse watched intently as his father worked, studying the concentration on Tank's face. The morning sun caught the silver in Tank's beard, highlighting the gentle way his hands moved despite their size and strength. "Your grandma," Tank said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She used to cut hair for the whole neighborhood?" He smiled at the memory. "Had the gentlest touch you ever felt. Used to say a good haircut could change how a person sees themselves." The scissors paused as Tank brushed away some loose hair from Jesse's shoulder. "I never told you much about her, have I?" Jesse shook his head slightly, careful not to disturb his father's work. "She was an artist, like you." Tank's voice grew soft with remembrance. "Could paint anything she saw. Taught me how to see beauty in broken things." He resumed cutting, each snip precise and careful. "Wish she could have met you?" Time seemed to slow in the small bathroom as father and son shared this quiet moment. The morning light strengthened, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, birds called to each other, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower hummed. Tank stepped back finally, studying his work with critical eyes. He ran the comb through Jesse's hair one last time, making sure everything was even. The cut was simple but neat, showing off Jesse's features instead of hiding them. "There," Tank said, brushing the last few loose hairs from Jesse's neck. "What do you think?" Jesse leaned forward, really looking at himself in the mirror for the first time in months. His hair was shorter now, clean and even, styled similar to how Tank wore his own. The change was subtle but profound. He looked older, stronger somehow. "I look like you, Dad," Jesse said, touching his hair in wonder. Tank's breath caught in his throat. The simple words hit him like a physical force, breaking through years of carefully maintained walls. Tears welled in his eyes as he placed his hands on Jesse's shoulders. "And you look strong," Tank whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the park as Tank spread out the checkered blanket under their favorite oak tree. Jesse sprawled out on his stomach, sketchbook open before him, while Maggie unpacked the picnic basket she'd brought from Ruby's. "Ham and cheese for the artist," she said, passing Jesse a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "And extra pickles for the mechanic." She winked at Tank as she handed him his. Tank's weathered face softened into a smile. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his beard and the fading ink of his tattoos, demons and skulls now partially covered by newer designs, a compass, a dove, his son's name in flowing script. Jesse looked up from his drawing, studying the clouds drifting overhead. "That one looks like a dragon," he said, pointing skyward. "Where?" Tank squinted up, shielding his eyes. "There. See the wings? And that part's breathing fire." Maggie lay back on the blanket, her auburn hair spreading out like a fan. "I see it. And look, there's one that looks just like your dad's motorcycle." Jesse grinned. "Yeah, but bigger." Tank watched them cloud-gazing, something warm and unfamiliar expanding in his chest. He thought about how different things were just months ago. The silence, the fear, the rage that had lived inside him like a caged animal. Now here they were, laughing about shapes in the clouds. As the afternoon mellowed toward evening, Jesse worked on his sketch, occasionally showing them his progress. It was a scene from the park. Families playing, dogs chasing frisbees, the old oak tree spreading its protective branches over them all. "You got my nose wrong," Tank grumbled good-naturedly, peering at his portrait in the corner of the drawing. Did not, Jessie protested. That's exactly how it looks since you broke it in that bar fight. Hey now, Tank started, but couldn't help chuckling. Maggie reached over and squeezed his hand. It gives you character. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Other families started packing up their picnics and heading home, but their little group lingered, savoring the peace of the moment. Jessie had dozed off on the blanket, his sketchbook still open beside him. Tank carefully closed it and tucked it into his backpack, then draped his leather jacket over his sleeping son. The sunset painted everything in warm light: the oak's leaves, Jessie's peaceful face, the silver in Tank's beard. Maggie watched as Tank tenderly adjusted the jacket around Jessie's shoulders, his massive hands moving with surprising gentleness. She leaned close to Tank, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes angels don't have wings. Sometimes they ride motorcycles. Tank's throat tightened as he took her hand in his. Together they watched the last rays of sunlight paint the world in peace. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.